back to the main thread. Today, we're going to be talking about introducing new tech to your company and your code base. Is it worth it? How do you decide whether that shiny new front-end framework or that highly performant memory-safe back-end language is really going to solve your problems? What if you work for a small company with highly constrained resources where investing time in a costly migration could mean the difference between staying within your runway or not? Heck, in 2023, even big tech has to deal with resource constraints. Let's join our guest Eric Justusson as we talk about how to leverage quick experiments, tracer bullets, greenfield projects, and hackathons, how to avoid yak shaving or bike shedding, and generally how to responsibly evaluate the benefits and costs of onboarding new tech for your team. Let's get into it.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the main thread. My name is Alex Geiser, and this is Brian Ogilvy. I'm here with Eric Justusson, a good friend of mine. He's the VP of Engineering at Project X Media. Eric is somebody I've known for a long time. He's one of the first people that I ever talked to about getting into software engineering, and he's somebody who really helped me get my start. So it's really great to have him here talking with us today. Eric, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hey, Alex. Good to be on here, and Brian as well. Yeah, as you said, I'm the VP of Engineering at Project X Media. We have our business is comprised of managed services agency where we buy and sell out-of-home media on behalf of our clients. We started off as a technology company, basically a platform for the out-of-home advertising industry. And so we're born out of tech. And then at some point along the way, maybe we'll talk about it on this podcast, we started an advertising agency. And so we're sort of going down both roads now, but VP of engineering and sort of an early member of the team here at Project X.
Cool. Yeah, so our topic for today is going to be, generally speaking, like introducing new technologies to an engineering team. And we thought that as somebody who is ultimately responsible for the technologies used by your company, that'd be an interesting thing to ask you about. It's something that we all deal with regularly. We all, as people who are responsible for at least certain areas of our engineering organizations, we are always thinking about needs and what types of technologies that we need to introduce potentially, or which ones are working, which ones aren't. When do you decide that you have a need that could be filled by changing a technology? How to identify which technologies would be helpful? What does that process look like for you?
Yeah. And first of all, I just want to say, Alex, very impressed with you sticking with this. As you mentioned that you did reach out to me, I think, early on in your journey here. And I'll say a lot of people have reached out to me over the years with a similar interest in all of this. But I think you're in a club of maybe 2 or 3 people who've actually done it. So kudos to you, man. You seem to have actually done it. And this podcast is a great example of that. And you pushing yourself. So good work with that.
I love the industry. I love the work, obviously. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing a podcast talking about it in my spare time for no money.
Not to mention how much we love accolades from our mentors.
We do. We love it so much. This is that has made it all worthwhile. Anyway, talk to us, Eric. What do you got?
Yeah. So it's a good topic. Certainly something that I've dealt with quite a bit over the years. I should preface this by saying my experience, even before Project X, has been at fairly small companies. So, we've been anywhere from like 2 to 12 people on the engineering side and, bigger in the whole company. So, that has its unique set of challenges. But in general, from an engineering team's perspective, you should really question why you're trying to introduce new technology. For one, I think a lot of times people get excited by new tech and want to use it without a good business case. So I'd say, first of all, you should figure out why you're doing it. Most of the good technology switches that I came across either came from a really good business reason to do it, or basically like we saw a problem that was just going to be a big problem down the road, and it really lent itself to introducing a big new set of technologies. Now, that being said, I should also say it depends on the cost. I'm very open to using new technology at a smaller scale, right? Like if it's just somebody wants to play around with a new library, somebody wants to try something a different way, and the cost isn't high, there's almost no downside to that. And, another thing that I've found useful over the years is I actually, it helps a lot if somebody already has some experience with some new technology that you're going to use. And so one thing that I've always encouraged really heavily is side projects and, people doing that type of thing out of work and, even going to the point of helping them out with those projects because, we've seen time and time again, and it's happened even recently, where someone's done something on their own, and it's that process that sort of convinced me, like, all right, maybe we do take on this new project with this new technology, given your experience with it outside of work. I should also say it depends on whether you're trying to introduce new technology into an existing project. I have right now some code that's, a decade old, or a code base at least that started a decade ago, versus greenfield projects, projects that we've started in the last year. And obviously it's a lot easier to introduce new technology in a greenfield project, especially if it's sort of big and impactful, than it is on, a legacy code base. So I think the evaluation and everything that goes into it really depends on those types of things.
So one of the things I want to ask you about, you mentioned earlier that you've primarily worked at smaller companies. And when you're in that type of environment, your resources can be incredibly precious. Maybe you're in your Series A, but you've got some kind of runway under which time you are meant to be finding a product market fit and finding a user base. And when you want to run, say, an experiment, someone has an idea, they want to use a new technology to solve a certain problem. How do you define the parameters under which that experiment can be run, where you feel safe saying, I'm comfortable with you doing this for a month, 6 weeks, after which time I need to see X, Y, Z in order to prove that it is worth allocating these very precious and scarce resources towards continuing this experiment? How do you go about that process?
Yeah, it's a good point, Brian, and it's definitely something that I think about. Resource allocation is always one of the trickiest things for us to balance. There's a lot of things we would love to do if we had the resources to do them, and so I do spend a lot of time saying no to on all sides, on the business side and on the tech side, and I hate to do that, but look, like it again depends on the scale of the project, but overall, like, I'm always looking for ways to do experiments like that sort of as cheap as you can. And so I think it's always good to try to find a way to introduce the new technology in sort of a scope that can be encapsulated into a sprint or two, let's say. Maybe, run a couple of weeks on it, see what you learn, maybe a couple more weeks if it's going well, but don't fall victim to sunk cost fallacy and make sure you're taking measurements pretty often. Some of that, sometimes in our case, might just be literally like, we still think this is worthwhile doing, but we actually think it's going to take us a lot longer to do this than we have budget for, in time or anything else. And so we need to kind of table it for now. Maybe sometime down the road that reintroduces itself, or we can find another way to do it. But I'd say, overall, I'm looking for cheap ways to do it. That can be easily done these days. A lot of things that, sometimes there's so many features that you can essentially write as like a microservice. And so, again, it depends what we're talking about. But if somebody's like, I want to try writing it with this library or in this language or whatever it is, and especially if it's like some sort of back-end service rather, we can throw that even on like a Lambda function or a step function to test it out in that regard, right? It doesn't have to be like replacing your entire back-end framework or something like that. And I do have some examples of that too, where we did decide to go that route for various things that were much bigger changes. But, there are lighter weight ways to do it. Usually we have, especially in these smaller companies that I've been involved in, we're always trying to push ourselves and find like new product market fit. Even when we have established products, we're always trying to push it, develop new products. So I find a lot of times we can use some of the greenfield projects as like a testing ground for new tech, and use that as a way to sort of learn about it. And then with that knowledge, we can decide, is this something we think we could bring back to our larger code base or to other areas? Is it worth refactoring? That's for me always, honestly, like, one thing that people don't seem to understand trying to get into the industry is there is a big advantage to doing something greenfield, right? And so like, a lot of times when people are starting out, it's, I know this tech, I know this tech, and I know that tech. I'm like, that's great. But what about when you're trying to decide how to implement that feature on a code base that has all sorts of other considerations and side effects to making a change like that. So
exactly.
One of the things that we find is really helpful when we're proposing a new technology is to say, all right, well, what is one step shy of a minimum viable product, like a little bit short of an MVP that you would actually put in the hands of users, what they refer to in the pragmatic programmer as a tracer bullet, which is putting together something that goes all the way through the components of the system, right? All of the important stuff that needs to be in place if you were going to use this for real. It's not a prototype, it's not fake, it's not a toy. It's like, it's really going to use the front end, it's really going to use the API layer, it's really going to use the database you're thinking of, it's really going to use the logging framework, but like identifying some feature, some small thing that would prove that the whole thing can work and that it's worth going ahead with. Is that something that you pursue, or is that a little bit too big for, like, say, one engineer to be able to go tinker with and show you?
No, I think that's great. And I like the way that you phrased all of that too. Especially, I'm thinking of our biggest code base here, the one that's been around forever. Well, in our world, 10 years. For that, we've totally done exactly what you're describing with new tech. And because especially the front end, all the tech really has evolved, since we started that project. We've had all sorts of things that we've done, like moving to React, even things like that, or moving to a real front end build system.
Everybody's classic case is like migrating their JavaScript framework, and how long are we really going to spend doing this before we're actually shipping features again? So if you find a way to actually continue shipping features while you're in the midst of that kind of a migration, that's kudos to you.
Or you do what we did, where you get halfway and then it's stuck in this weird Frankenstein half Angular JS getting mutated into React for literally like 5 years. So there is
serializing your component state across frameworks.
Something like that. That leads me to like the next question I have is like, there's always this push and pull between introducing new technology and the cost therein versus fracturing your code base. You introduce React, a clear upgrade over AngularJS to the point where AngularJS is not even supported any longer. But you do have this problem where large portions of your code base, unless you do a clean break and just start over, are in AngularJS. Moving on in the microservice architecture, like you mentioned, you can have, if you also do multi-repo, you can have your repositories in different sections of the code that can look completely alien to each other. And then so when you have somebody onboarding, right, and can be very difficult because we have portions of our code base that just have not been touched for a long time, and they're different. So when somebody needs to be onboarded, it's like kind of like relearning the whole code base all over again, and that's partially because we've done several clear upgrades, and that can cause fracturing of the code base. And so I wonder, how do you deal with that?
Oh, yeah. And to use that, so we were using initially Backbone. I was doing it before there were frameworks like this at all. And so all of these things along the way felt like great upgrades.
They always do.
But there is a cost, like you said, and it is an upgrade. And hence the like greenfield, sort of bias,
right.
Of just like, hey, we should use this because it's better. And I would say like that is part of the equation, right? And I wouldn't get too hung up, even in your case, where you're like, well, some stuff's in React, some stuff's this. React's clearly better. That is part of the equation. But the other part of the equation is just like, you can't go rewrite your code base every few years when there's a better way to do it. Yeah. If you architect stuff reasonably well with the technologies that you have at the time, and it works, you should keep it until it's becoming sort of cost prohibitive to add to it or add new features. And even there, so like what we ended up doing in that case, we had to move at some point to even just like a front end build system using Webpack and stuff, which we didn't have originally. And so that was even a process in itself, which we did. And we also introduced React. And for React, like what we did was what we do with a lot of stuff, right? Where there was like one component of the system. And it's like, we'll do like this, manager for this thing in React and see how that goes. It's like, oh, that's pretty good. And then we built a way to kind of hook it into Backbone components for certain cases. So we could like, all right, we can add new stuff with React, but we're going to keep Backbone. And we did dabble in rewriting some like core components in Backbone. To go back to your question, Brian, it was like, I think I gave somebody like, take like this sprint to see if you can rewrite this, sidebar list view that is like jQuery and Backbone and using just tons of event bindings and all these things as a React component. And, after we ran the experiment for a little while, it was like, this is just going to be hell. Like, it's not worth it. And so like, in those cases, what you end up doing is being like, let's save it. We'll save it until there's sort of either a more compelling reason to kind of rewrite this in a more significant way, or just maintain this code. And to the fracturing point, like that does happen. It can be hard if like somebody's joining on and it's like Backbone and React and this and that. But I would go back to just the most important thing usually is just decent practices in writing code that's easy to read. And, I would just suggest that as a general rule of thumb is, when you're doing code reviews or just writing code and pairing with your team, like definitely have a strong bias for like, I might come back to this later. I might be using a whole different technology. I might not remember how Backbone works, but if the code's organized, in a way that it's readable, you'll still be able to figure out what's going on. Right. And I think that just comes with experience. Maybe somebody who's more junior will have a harder time with that, but that's just kind of part of the process of being a junior engineer. And I would just generally recommend people get exposed to different languages and become fairly language and framework agnostic. I don't think people should get so hung up. I mean, people do, right? People get very like ideological about what languages and frameworks and all these things that they're using. And I find for me, that usually doesn't matter as much as a lot of other things.
That makes sense.
So I'm curious about if you ever make decisions like this, like big technological choices based not solely on the merits of the tech itself, but on how that choice will affect your hiring pool. Specifically, I'm thinking about, like we've been talking about React. React is really popular right now. Every boot camp is teaching React. People are coming into the industry, at least with the expectation that they should be familiar with React because that's what everyone's hiring for. And so if you are hiring for it, maybe you get a lot more high quality candidates you can choose from versus if you choose something a little more obscure, like say Scala, which Alex talks about a lot. Like there's a much smaller community for Scala, right? And maybe if you're looking to hire a very senior engineer, you can probably find someone who's very skilled at Scala. But if you need to fill out your engineering core with juniors who can be mentored and brought up, do you ever make a technological choice based solely on that?
I would say not solely,
sure,
but it definitely does factor in. React is a good, continues to be a good example in this conversation, but, that definitely did factor into my consideration there. It wasn't the only thing. I guess what I'll say is if it aligns with everything else, then that's also some weight that I would add to it, especially if there were a couple of technologies that, I was choosing between that were sort of more or less equal and one is wider adopted. In fact, React, really was that, right? Because I had friends at the time that we were doing it who were like, no, Vue is cooler. You got to do this, you got to do that. Like, there's all these different kind of things. And one of the considerations really was like, React has a much wider adoption, that people are learning it. It's just going to be, like you said, easier to hire against it. But I wouldn't do that if I also didn't think it was the best or on footing with being the best technology. I think overall, if I'm going to make a shift, I'm trying to usually bet on what I think is going to have a good community around it, in part, because even if somebody doesn't know it, are they going to be able to learn it? Are we going to ourselves be able to find a community of people who are going to help us answer the questions we have around it? Is it going to continue to get support? So all of that factors in, but not so much I'll say, for a while, I feel like all the boot camps were teaching Ruby on Rails. And
absolutely,
I would not have chosen to use Ruby on Rails just because they were teaching it, because I'm just not a huge fan. So
I didn't want to use it when I was being taught it in a boot camp. Yeah,
I didn't know any better, and I've never touched it. Don't enjoy this
at all.
So how do you vet a technology? What do you do when you have to pick something? You're like, we've already decided we want to do something. We have a number of different ways that we could do it. How do I pick which one?
Yeah, I mean, it's never in isolation. Part of it is you want a good culture around these things, right? In the same sense that you don't want people to be ideologues about what technologies they're using. I think it's good to encourage the whole team or whatever team is sort of relevant to that decision, whoever's going to be using it, to participate in that. And, I'll usually ask people bring ideas forward, bring, whatever ideas people have about the direction we should take. And then, I think it's just good general life practice to be a good critical thinker, right? And so don't get too attached to one technology or another because of hype or this or that, but really go just have that conversation. Basically try to argue for and against all of them. And usually you'll end up with a couple of front runners. And from there, usually it is running an experiment, finding a feature that we can try, right? And then seeing what we learn. And, that's, honestly, usually how we arrive at a consensus for a new tech. I mean, I don't find that it's usually choosing between 30 things. It's usually choosing between maybe 1 to 3, 2 or 3 things in my experience.
We've talked a bit about running an experiment, and in that context, you mentioned like you would ask one engineer to maybe spend the next sprint experimenting with something, trying to replace a nav bar or something like that. If the experiment would require a few more resources, a lot of companies have a strong culture of hackathons. And I mean, obviously my company is a huge hackathon culture, but a lot of smaller companies do as well. And I'm wondering if that's something you've ever entertained doing. And if you wanted to entertain it for the benefit of getting a lot of people in the room for a few days to hack on something that may be thrown away at the end or may be expanded upon later, what would it look like trying to get buy-in for that kind of culture in, as we mentioned, a smaller company's environment with constricted resources and maybe a limited runway?
Yeah, great. So, we actually, I should say, I'm a little hesitant to admit that we haven't done one in a while, but we, historically have done them.
Nice.
I don't know what the most frequent we ever did them was, but, let's say like at least several times a year, sometimes more frequently than that. And again, it's been a little while now. But we always, I think especially in the beginning, did find those really helpful. I mean, for a bunch of reasons. I don't think it was ever that hard to justify to the company because just for like team building alone, it was great.
Absolutely.
We would use those as a way to play sometimes with technology that we had no real use case for, but just somebody was interested in. Somebody's like, I really just want to write something and go. Or whatever, like, whatever we were trying to do. I mean, I remember we did all sorts of fun ones, but like, we'd make billboards and out of home advertising and stuff like that. So we made something at some point that was like Instagram kind of, but just for like billboards. And, it's like, you get to like play around with a simple idea like that. You can use like basically any front end framework you want. The backend was in Go because we were just like, that sounds fun. And, that kind of thing is great. And you end up maybe learning like one useful thing out of that experience. We've had other ones that are a little bit more focused on like a specific technology that we are vetting, and we just do some project in a way to explore it. If we don't have like an easy way to do it in another way, it's like, well, then let's just do this in a hypothetical situation, or maybe something that's sort of tangentially related to work, but we know is almost definitely not going to actually be used, do some sort of like fun app that's sort of quasi related to work, but it's not, we're not expecting it to go to production or anything. It's more for mess around internally. And I do think I think that's a really important part of engineering culture. I mean, that and, the other thing that we do a lot would be like brown bag kind of things, right? Internally, we'd also, especially since we were small, there was one point where we had this office in Soho and there were a bunch of other startups around, and we do it with other offices in the building too. So, and that was a good way to share knowledge, right? So we'd have, just have lunch together and have somebody talk about their experience with something, basically.
So like there's a corollary from running an experiment, trying out a new technology, and say you love it and you decide you want to start using more of it. There's a corollary to that, which is deprecating old technology. And they often go hand in hand. And how do you go about bridging that subject with your employees, say? Because it's easy to get excited about a greenfield project with new tech. It's a lot harder to get excited about, now I have to start changing what I do day to day. I have to start saying goodbye to this code that I've been a part of for a while, or maybe start pulling it apart again and redoing bits. How do you manage that at a company your size?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Or at any company, really.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think overall, again, a lot of this is going to come back to just like trying to create a good culture around these kinds of things. I mean, some of it is just balancing it. I always try to pay a lot of attention, for lack of any other sort of pressing priority. A lot of times I'll prioritize based on what I think will be the most fun, honestly, for people. Because I think it just creates, people do their best work and when they're having fun. But part of that is also demonstrating and encouraging, people to see the fun in almost any project. It can actually be a lot of fun to remove a ton of code. I love when there's like a diff where it's like negative,
negative like
10,000 lines.
Yeah.
Exactly.
We have something called Dead Code Society, where if you show your diff where you deleted like 10,000 lines of code, or it could even be a collection of diffs. So you get like a T-shirt that says Dead Code Society and membership in this group and a badge on your profile. It's great.
Bring that to my work. I just got a couple of those in. I need a shirt, man.
Yeah,
I love it. And I'd say a lot of times that's coupled with replacing it with a new technology. So that can make it more fun, right? So, if it's deprecating something, I think like in general, I always encourage people, and I've been lucky to have great people to work with, which helps. But I think overall, I don't want anybody who's going to have that sort of attitude about it either. Of just like I got to change the way I do. It's like we all have to evolve in this thing, right? Like I'm almost nothing that I'm doing today is stuff that I was doing when I started, or that was even around. And so like it's always constant involvement, and I think as part of being engineers is just and this is what gets people on their journey all the time, is that imposter syndrome. And part of that's because you have to spend a lot of time having no idea what you're doing.
Right.
And get really
it really has
comfortable.
it does not matter how good you are at the thing you're doing right now. You'll be doing something different in 5 years, and you won't know what that is when you start.
Yeah.
Right.
It's
And I
it's a
think
never-ending cycle.
if you're very comfortable with what you're doing, like I'm almost more scared of that, right? Like I feel more uncomfortable with that than if I'm feeling uncomfortable about what we're doing. And I think part of that is just you want to be continuing to push yourselves, right? Push yourselves to learn more. I definitely believe in the run off the cliff and then like build the ground underneath you kind of thing, right? Like I mean within reason.
Maybe at least have some building materials with you when you jump off the cliff.
Or at least know how to build a glider or whatever before you jump.
Or have some reason to jump off the cliff. Don't just do it for no reason. But if there's some reason that's the direction you should be going, go a little bit further than you're comfortable with pretty much at all times, I would say.
Right.
And some of my, we had one the other day, some of my favorite times are honestly like tracing down some terrible, weird, elusive bug or some fire drill that just pushes you in a way that where some people might consider that, really mind-numbing work or just kind of despairing in a way. But I find those sometimes to be the most fun adventures because you're just like it's like a big puzzle and you're in this mode of like, I have no idea what's going on, but that's a fun state to be in. That means you're learning. That means, it will resolve at some point. And so I don't know. So I guess a lot of that just comes down to trying to instill that as part of the culture and just not being afraid of change. I think that's really important for us to adopt as engineers, unless you want a job where you're just writing an API adapter the same way, very slightly different for the same thing for a big health insurance company or something, which I think is a great way to go absolutely nowhere. And I felt bad whenever I'd interview people, and I did a few times, who were basically in a job like that, who started off in a great place, but then went somewhere where they were basically doing the same thing for 5 years. And you really saw the downside of that, as opposed to being a full stack engineer, as opposed to being able to jump around to different things or get really niche in one thing, but kind of stay up and solve different problems with it. So that's a long way of getting around it. But I think like a lot of things, this just comes down to culture and also bringing people into the decision-making process, right? I would never just tell people to do something without kind of explaining why we're doing it. And so I think, you get people invested maybe in engineering one level up, which is just, we're also trying to grow a business. And like, so, bringing just engineering thinking to business decisions and how we think about the business and the business strategy and what the tech we're doing, how that plays in a role in it. So, I think you get your team, if you get your team invested in it, then, we all roll up our sleeves and do the work that needs to get done.
Cool. Yeah, so important to be the person who draws the lines from the business priorities to the code being written. Here is the connection between this hard work that you're doing and the business, that the impact we're actually trying to have in the world as a company.
100%. And that, I think you said it great there. I mean, that's maybe some of it is just explaining why it's important. Because if it isn't important, then you shouldn't be doing it. That is kind of silly. But if you're deciding to do it as a business, even if it's not on the surface exciting, it probably has business impact or is important in some other way. And so, being able to understand its importance and also just, not kind of making one person do all the terrible jobs like that or something.
Right.
I think it's just a balance of all those types of things, right?
On the subject of balance, I do think it's time to move us over to the other side of the ravine with picks and plugs.
So first, I'll plug my business. Why not? It's pjxmedia.com. We will help you buy billboards, wallscapes, subway ads, anything out of home. We have a tech platform that's well known in the industry that buyers and sellers use to do these types of transactions. And it's an exciting company, and we do use a lot of tech to be competitive in our space. So I'll definitely plug that a little bit. And then in terms of some like useful stuff for the pod, I mean, one thing that I just think doing a lot of reading is always helpful. I know you guys have talked about book lists. One thing that I just, I've always loved looking at Hacker News, by Ycom. Like that's something that's like literally just up as like a placeholder tab for like the last 10, 12 years on my browser. Just skimming it every day, I think it's just good to have a sense of what's going on. And I mean, take a pulse on the industry, right? Have an idea of what technologies people are using, read, quick, fun blurbs, but then go deep too, right? And then, I looked it up actually to see if it was still going on. But back when I was in the city more, there was a great like meetup called, I think like CTO School or something like that. But I'm sure there's something else now that seems like it's defunct. But, where people would meet up in person and go through all these like hypothetical scenarios together and really just help each other. So I think if people are trying to go that direction, like looking around for other people who are in that space and just kind of, again, just like helping each other is a great way to go. So I just plug that as general advice. And then, just for people's amusement, because this is kind of like a fun thing for me. I love like all the engineering, like random idioms. I don't know if you guys are fans of those too, but if people aren't a fan of them, I would recommend, learning and using, some of my favorites like yak shaving, bike shedding, running into the spike, obviously rubber duck debugging. I heard you guys talking about pragmatic programmer, but cargo culting, all of those are worth looking up and using. And even teaching we use a lot of those just even in like leadership meetings at our company, non-tech people. And I think like applying engineering thinking and problem solving to business problems is a great way to contribute more than just to the code at a company. Like bring your thinking, because engineering thinking is very strong, and individual contributor, anybody can go kind of like go talk to other people and try to help them problem solve, think about things, and just, have a genuine interest in solving problems at the business. And that's just another great way to grow.
Alex, what do you got for us?
I'm reading the Gang of Four book again. It's the design pattern
Nice.
books. I've read it at least in pieces several times, but this time I'm kind of going through the intro, which is really cool because the intro is like how you would use the design patterns to build a WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get text editor, which is kind of a really cool case study that I've seen a number of different places, like how to build a text editor. And that's a kind of a common sort of example because it's like a application that touches a lot of different things, but it doesn't really get into the web side of things. So it's kind of like a nice concrete unit. And then this case study goes through how you would use each of these design patterns to build it. But what's really cool about it in this case, and what I never really noticed before, is that it's just really a good book about design generally. Like it gets a lot of problems because it is very object oriented, and a lot of the specific patterns kind of are only really an issue in Smalltalk and C++ and Java. A lot of the patterns are also just like built directly into languages now, and then like the kind of like the focus on functional programming has made a lot of them like irrelevant. But then this time I'm going through it with the idea of, well, what can it teach me about just answering a question in any way, like regardless of like the paradigm, like how does it address the problem? And it's actually really, really good at that. It's like it just kind of like reevaluating this book kind of is like really opened my eyes in a lot of ways. It's been really fun to just go through it and see what it has to say. Just generally.
That's a really good idea. It's been a couple of years since the last time I read that, and I think it would be great to go back and explore it the way you said, instead of trying to memorize all these design patterns, which I'll mostly not use. I mean, there's a few that I go to all the time, but most of the time I'm not going to use them because, like you said, they're built into the language, or I'm writing more functionally anyway these days. But the idea of like how did they approach this problem and then how did they arrive at a solution is pretty cool way to look at it.
It's still good, like Picasso said, right? Learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. I think it's still good to know them, and then do what makes sense and do what is fun and do what is readable. I can't stress readability. It matters so much more than people give it credit for. Everyone's trying to be very like clever with code all the time, and I'm like, please just make it so we can read this.
Yeah, no, I remember the very first time I saw code that the most senior member of my engineering team wrote. And, when I was new in the industry, and I just remember thinking, like, is that all there is? Like, it's so simple. And, like, there's not that much to it. And he was like, yeah, that's right.
Exactly.
Anyone can read this. Anyone understands what it does. It is not overly clever. You don't feel like you need a PhD to like get started in this code base, right? It's simple. It does what it says it does. Cool. So I'm going to go entirely analog for my pick here. So my family and I enjoy sometimes, especially if it's raining outside, doing puzzles together. And we found this company called Unidragon Puzzles, and they make these absolutely gorgeous wooden carved puzzles. The patterns and art on them are already beautiful, but every single piece has its own distinct shape. Like some of them are actually in the shape of birds or dragonflies or stars or hands and things like that. So some of them are identifiable shapes and others are totally random, but they're so intricate. And the puzzle is hefty. It's like, it's, done on, like Marley board. And so it's really thick, beautiful. It smells great when you open it because it's cut wood. Anyway, so love them. And if you are someone who enjoys doing old person things like I am, like sitting down and doing puzzles on a weekend when it's raining, these are really great. And then with that brings us to the end of the show. I can't believe it happened so fast. But Eric, thank you so much for the time. Great hearing about your company, about Project X and everything you guys are doing. And thanks for sharing your insight on how to manage these introductions of new technologies.
Hey, it's been a lot of fun, guys. And now, of course, I'm thinking of all sorts of other stories. So we'll have to do a part 2 sometime.
Yeah, we'll do a sequel.
Yeah, we'll have you back on. Don't worry.
Well, thanks again. Listeners, really appreciate you tuning in, and we will catch you next time. Thanks for listening to The Main Thread. As always, the views expressed by the hosts and guests of The Main Thread are our own and do not reflect those of our respective places of employment. Are you enjoying the podcast? Do you have a topic you'd like to hear discussed in a future episode? Well, please reach out to us with any suggestions or feedback. We are at The Main Thread on all major social media platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and of course, Threads. If you prefer, you can send us an email at mainthreadpodcast@gmail.com. For links to resources mentioned in today's episode or to download a transcript of the podcast, please refer to our show notes. That's all for today's episode. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next time on The Main Thread.